Hello everyone, I'm Simon Haines and this is the Ramsay Centre online and welcome to the 9th event of this year in our Ramsay Distinguished Lecture series. We've already had, as you would probably know, we've had some wonderful talks in 2023, including most recently, and this was not online but it was live here in Sydney, a talk by the distinguished Cambridge historian of France and of England, Robert Toombs, who asked, and of course he answered this question in the affirmative, he asked, are the history wars worth fighting? You may have caught that online, terrific talk. But also we've hosted live here in Sydney, Professor Joseph Henrich, Professor of Biological Anthropology at Harvard, who developed for us the thesis of his best-selling book, wonderfully entitled, The Weirdest People in the World, which explains how religion, marriage and the family made the West both psychologically peculiar and particularly prosperous. So both lectures are available online at our website, www.ramsaycentre.org. And I'm mentioning them in particular because today's lecture can be seen in a way as the third instalment in a trilogy on the broad question of what it is historically that makes the West unique, when that uniqueness is now so often deplored or even denied, ironically enough, mostly in the West itself. So, today, our guest, if he is not the world's greatest living authority on this subject, then at least I think it's fair to say nobody else has a better claim. An historian of philosophy, specializing in Islamic, Jewish and Christian thought of the Middle Ages, Rémi Brague is Professor Emeritus of Arabic and Religious Philosophy at the University of Paris, the Sorbonne, and he's also Romano Guardini Chair of Philosophy Emeritus at the Ludwig Maximilian University of Munich. He has spent a lifetime exploring the roots of European civilization, engaging with classical, medieval and modern texts in their original languages. He's the author of many books on classical and medieval intellectual history, religion, national identity, literature and law, and that probably includes his masterwork, a trilogy on the philosophical development of law in the West. But the work Professor Brague is best known for in the English-speaking world, which may or may not be a matter of bemusement to him, but there it is, the one we will mostly be talking about today is Europe, la voie romaine, or translated into English as eccentric culture, a theory of Western civilization. I should add, by the way, that unlike many people who either declare or deplore or deny the uniqueness of the West, Professor Brague is deeply knowledgeable about another great civilization as well, namely the Islamic one, which is the subject of his latest book, not yet translated into English, I'm afraid to say, but I certainly hope it soon will be, and in French it's simply called On Islam, Sur Islam. So Professor Brague has kindly agreed to join us from Paris today, where he's sitting now, and to give us an opportunity to ask him about his vision of Western, or more precisely European civilization, including why the Romans' attitude to the Greeks in particular was so significant in the development of Western culture, and what the importance of tradition, transmission is in any healthy civilization, the importance of the past to the future. So first of all, Professor Rémi Brague, welcome to the Ramsay Centre. Very good to have you join us.
Well, thank you so much for your so kind invitation.
So your book, which is translated as Eccentric Culture in English, you develop in the book the thesis that the Roman way, as you call it, is central to the development of European culture. Now, of course, we're pretty accustomed to the idea of a double heritage from, as it were, Jerusalem and Athens, Hebraism and Hellenism, the Jewish and the Greek sources of the West, if you like. But you place even more centrally Rome, or the Roman attitude. So your argument is unusual in putting the stress here not on what the Romans directly contributed in the form of architecture and military science and language and literature and so on, which you might call the content of our civilization, but you talk more about its form, I think, and this is connected with the Roman sense, your word, of inferiority vis-a-vis Greek culture, their sense of being a pipeline or a transmission rather than an origin. So I'm just wondering if you could explain for us a little bit about how you see that sense of inferiority to Greece, an initially subordinated feeling, which you call secondarity in English. Why was it so productive? Why is it good to be a mode of transmission rather than an origin? You say that to identify ourselves as Romans is opposite to saying we are original. You call it a divestiture, not a claim. So tell us about all of this central kind of thesis in this wonderful book of yours.
Well, thank you for the compliment. Well, first of all, let me restate a point, an important point. There really are only two important sources of Western or European or you name it culture, i.e. Athens and Jerusalem. I wholeheartedly agree to what Matthew Arnold called Hebraism and Hellenism. This is true. And as far as the content of our culture is concerned, well, you've just put your finger on the strong and sore point at the same time about Rome, i.e. that Rome, well, did contribute its might to our culture. But this might was not mighty. It was only a way, or mainly a way for Rome to bring to us, to bring to Europe, both the heritage of Athens and of Jerusalem. There is some sort of parallelism between the Roman ways, the two ways, the way leading from Athens to our humble selves, and from Jerusalem to our, well, not humble enough selves. What I mean with Rome's inferiority complex is a historical fact. You know, the historians are, well, most knowledgeable about that. What happened in the 2nd century before Christ was first on the battlefield a crushing victory of the Roman armies over the Greeks. Greece lost its independence, became a Roman province, so the province of Achaia and places like that. But at the same time, in the teeth of Rome's superiority over the Greek armies, the Roman elite, well, I say the Romans, but that's shorthand for the Roman elite. Of course, the average Roman yokel was not aware of that. But the Roman elites got conscious of an overwhelming cultural superiority of the Greeks. And in the book you were kind enough as to quote, I myself quote some lines by Virgil, in which some sort of Roman mission is delineated. Rome will have to be the cop of the Mediterranean, will have to introduce some order to make, well, traveling and exchanging wares possible in the Mediterranean realm. But as far as higher culture is concerned, the Greeks will be better painters, better architects, better philosophers, better scientists, and so on and so forth. And well, this attitude of the Romans was not self-evident. Another attitude was exemplified, for instance, by the Russian Slavophiles in the 19th century. Those people were not stupid, they were absolutely conscious of the economic and even political and cultural superiority of Western Europe. But they said, in a nutshell, we are not as civilized as those people, but we are less corrupted. We are less corrupted. We have kept the purity of the, well, allegedly Christian and peasant mores. Russian people is morally superior. And well, this is precisely what the Romans did not do, but they had the pluck not to do. For this attitude is not pleasant. You know, it's always unpleasant to have to acknowledge one's weakness, one's inferiority. But there is a flip side, and a very good flip side to that. If we feel sort of inferior to some people, well, this opens up a possibility for us to imitate them, to learn. And this is why the Roman elite, which I alluded to a while ago, learned Greek. And there's even this nice anecdote about old Cato, who was a staunch supporter of old Roman mores. He might have been a Slavophile if he had been born some centuries later in Russia. But at the end of his life, well, he sort of surrendered and learned Greek. And this inferiority complex, well, triggered the effort among European elites to improve their own culture, to get rid of the stench of barracks. The Romans were soldiers. To get rid of this stench by washing themselves with a Greek soap. And well, as a matter of fact, I wrote this book. The first edition was published in '92, and the third and last one is a pocket book in '99. But I recently discovered, and well, I say this while blushing to the tip of my ears, I discovered that this idea had been put forward by another man, a real historian. I'm no historian. I'm, well, a philosopher who reads some history, but I'm no historian. And another, a real historian, who unfortunately passed away last year, a Tunisian by the name of Hichem Djait, came up, if my memory serves me, in 1978 or 1979, that's something like that. He came up with a booklet on Europe and Islam. That's the title. The book was written in French. And well, I read it last year and discovered, to my greatest amazement, that he had this very idea, i.e., that in the teeth of the legend about European arrogance. We are the better, we are more beautiful, we are more intelligent, and so on and so forth. Well, behind all that, behind this smoke screen of pride, there was a deep feeling of humility. That's the word he uses, humility, towards a culture which was objectively earlier and which was felt as superior. And this culture was the Greek culture. And now what is extraordinary in the history of European civilization is that the Roman stance, well, did not stop with the demise of the Roman Empire, let alone with the end of the era of the Scipios, the so-called Scipio era, the 2nd century before Christ. It lasted, and it could last because it was powerfully helped by another inferiority, another what I call secondarity, not towards the Greeks any longer, but towards the First Testament. We used to call the Hebrew Bible the Old Testament. But this was a time, by the way, in which old was rather a word of praise, wisdom, experience, and so on. At present, old, well, we feel old means old hat, something obsolete. But the First Testament, i.e., the first covenant, the documents of the first covenant, well, is the ground for the Christian revelation. The Christian revelation, well, would be utterly ununderstandable were it not for the presence of the first covenant documented in the books of the Hebrew Bible. And there is, by the way, an interesting utterance by Seneca, by the Roman philosopher Seneca, quoted by Augustine in the City of God, which is an exact parallel to the famous line by Horace. I don't know how you call this Roman poet, Horace. Okay. Well, Gracia capta ferum victorem cepit, and so on. Well, everybody knows that. It might even be in the textbooks for people who learn Latin, who are happy enough to learn Latin. Well, Greece, which had been vanquished its own, well, boorish victor, and introduced, well, culture into Latium, into Rome. And there is an exact parallel. Seneca says that Rome vanquished, crushed the Jewish rebellion in Judea with Vespasian and people like that, but the Jews are invading Rome with their mores, and especially with what we call their religion. And so there are two inferiorities, two secondarities in European culture: Rome towards the Greeks, and Christianity, or Christians, towards the first revelation, the first covenant. And were it not for the presence of this second secondarity, so to speak, probably the first secondarity, i.e., Rome towards Greece, would have been lost. But what is interesting in the history of European culture is the almost uninterrupted series of gettings back to Greece, what we call by the name of Renaissance. For some historians, there was only the Italian Renaissance. But in fact, if we look more deeply into European history, we'll have to realize that there was a first Renaissance, perhaps already at the beginning of the 6th century, with people like Cassiodorus, and then another Renaissance with Charles the Great, and a third one in the 12th century when they rediscovered the poetry of Ovid, and again and again, perhaps till the 19th century, and perhaps even till the 20th century, with Werner Jaeger's Third Renaissance. It was his word, And for this reason, well, I claim, that's my claim, that the alleged superiority of European culture, which brings about, pride, arrogance, and this is true. Unfortunately, we have to acknowledge our sins. But this arrogance is sort of the result of a first feeling of inferiority and of the feeling of a necessity of our having to learn, to go to school.
That's so fascinating, and it's partly so interesting because maybe we've got used to the idea of Rome as an arrogant, imperializing power, and the idea that Rome might think of itself as a secondarity and something that is an heir and a transmitter rather than an origin and a source is something that really fascinates me, and is something very, I think, unique and original about your book. And on the other hand, as you've just referred to, you say intriguingly, the Roman structure is the very structure of Christian reality. So this is an intriguing. Can you just talk about that for a minute or two?
Well, the main thesis of my book is the existence of two parallel structures, i.e., two feelings of inferiority, which produced in the European mind a strong desire for compensation. If you feel small, well, you'll have to sort of imagine that at some point you are better. And this is, in my opinion, the source, the origin of our pride. This pride is a reality, and we have to ask for forgiveness. We have to apologize towards the other cultures. You mentioned the word imperialism. Well, this is a historical reality. This is a historical reality. We have to acknowledge it, and to perhaps to regret and to ask for forgiveness. And by the way,
at the same time, yeah, at the same time, please forgive me for interrupting you. At the same time, I think, if I've got this right, your thesis is that, so to speak, originally, the Roman attitude was not arrogant, was in fact quite secondary and in a way humble. And you're arguing for a return to that sense of humility and secondarity, if I understand.
Certainly. Well, the Romans were both. Depending on the kind of people you are talking about, I'm not sure that the military was so humble, but people who had a direct access to Greek literature, to Greek art, and to Greek science, law and science, let's say, could not help feeling inferior and having to learn. And the historical luck of European culture is that the humble stance won out. Could not push back totally the feeling of superiority among people who colonized some countries and who behaved towards the local people in a way which was not always, to put it mildly, up to the Christian standards. Okay, well, you know that in Australia, but we French people have no reason to brag about what we did in Africa. Well, be that as it may, we are now living, interestingly, in a paradoxical attitude towards our own guilt. I was given the opportunity, not in my book, but probably in some interview I had with the press, with some journalist. I had the opportunity to put my finger on some sort of perverted version of the sacrament of confession, of the sacrament of penance, i.e., there's a great deal of people in present-day Europe, at least in France, who sort of are make the experience of a confession of sins without absolution, without the possibility of asking for forgiveness and receiving forgiveness, which is something that each and every human being has to do at some point in his or her life. And as far as Europe is concerned, well, I would plea for, I would ask people for a renewed consciousness of the basic stance which made European culture, i.e., balancing, the conscience of our achievements, which are great. I mean modern science, I mean democracy, I mean all kind of pretty good things. We should balance the consciousness of our achievements with a consciousness not only of our shortcomings, but of the necessity for us to learn, to go to school, as I told you a while ago, and to take advantage of the cultural treasures which are buried in other cultures. Well, if you look at my library behind me, you'll see there's a great deal of books in Arabic, in Hebrew, and in other languages. Well, my stance towards those books is not only the superiority of the philologically armed scholar. That's at the same time the attitude of the pupil, who has to try to assimilate and to take advantage of what other cultures have produced, have brought forward, which might be, interesting. Not only as, say, the entomologist studies an insect, but as a human being tries to understand his or her neighbor.
Yes,
And tries to learn.
yes, or indeed not just his or her neighbour, but his or her ancestors. And I was so interested in your description of Roman culture as transmissive, as a transmission. I think you used the image of the aqueduct, the Roman aqueduct, transmitting the water from earlier culture on through to later cultures. Can you talk a bit about this notion that civilization itself can be thought of as transmissive, in a sense that the civilizing process is one of, at least in the West anyway, is one of transmission rather than of source or originating? Can you speak to that for a second?
Well, first of all, I like your speaking of a source. There's a common parlance at present referring to the roots of our culture, the roots. Well, this is an image, which I do not that much like, because roots are something static. You have roots if you are the tree, and you simply have to wait for the sap to go into your branches, twigs, flowers, fruits, and so on. You haven't anything to do. Whereas, as soon as you use the word source, well, this implies that you'll have to get to take your bucket and go to the source and fetch water in order to water your garden and things. Well, the image is dynamic. That's why I like it.
Mm.
By the way, the image of the aqueduct is not mine. I borrowed it from a review written by an Italian journalist. His name was Beniamino Placido, and he wrote for a rather well-known Italian newspaper. And he wrote a review of the very first edition, 92, of my booklet on Europe. And well, this might be, if my memory serves me, the title of the article he devoted to my stuff. And then I found the image especially illuminating because in order to have an aqueduct which functions, well, you have to have a slope. You have to have a higher point and higher source and a lower, let's say, lower sinks, lower taps. Did you say tap or faucet in the
Americans say faucet. Americans say faucet.
Yes,
we say
I
tap.
But you say tap. Okay. Then you must have a slope. You must have a difference of level. And in order to have culture, in order to have civilization, you have to be able to transmit something, and not to take. Well, the civilized person doesn't take him or herself, his or her knowledge, achievements, doings, whatnot, for granted. The educated person has to receive, had to learn, had to get something from the outside. And this is the very process of civilization. There is no civilization without some sort of transmission. Transmission coming from the past, from our ancestors, transmission coming from the outside for our neighbors, but certainly not coming from our so interesting navels.
Yes.
Self-centeredness is the end of any civilization, the end
Yes,
of any
indeed.
culture. And it was the greatness, well, barring all its sinful doings, barring imperialism, barring all kind of unpleasantnesses, as the British would say. For the Brits, the Black Death was an unpleasantness. The Shoah was an unpleasantness. Of course, the
British
wonderful
understatement.
title of this Dorothy Sayers novel, Unpleasantness at the Bellona Club, and the unpleasantness of the discovery of a corpse in the locker room. Well, be that as it may. As it may, not our civilization, but just any civilization has an element of transmission. Yeah.
Yes. Well, this is so
Sorry.
interesting. This is so interesting.
Sorry, I'm so talkative.
And I in a way, I'm diverting the conversation slightly at that point, because you mentioned any civilization, and I'm so conscious of your reputation as a scholar of Islam as well as a scholar of the West, if you like. And to me, your book is just as fascinating about Islam and Byzantium, in fact, as it is about Rome and about Europe. And I just wonder whether, in the time that we have, whether you could also tell us a little about why you see those other two civilizations, the Byzantine and the Muslim, the Islamic one, as you see, do you see them as, in a sense, non-secondary, whereas the Roman inheritance is a secondariness of civilization? They are not. And so crucially, possibly, I don't know whether I'm putting words in your mouth here, but you've been talking about, as it were, the humility and the modesty of this Roman transmissiveness of civilization. Would you contrast that at all with the Islamic and Byzantine attitudes to translation, maybe to the Quran as the pure, the source, the pure book, or Byzantine attitudes towards Hellenism as something that's still alive in them? They have a direct connection with that source and that origin, versus, on the other hand, what you've argued is the Roman attitude of feeling, I think your word in the title of the English title of your book, the Roman attitude of being eccentric, off-center.
Mm-hmm.
You know, Charlemagne's consciousness of his capital city of Aachen as inferior to Rome or Constantinople, versus an Islamic feeling that the Quran is the pure, uncorrupted source, which they own and still have, and the Byzantine attitude towards the Hellenistic origins as something pure and original, which they still are. Whereas the Roman one is different, is in a sense secondary. Can you speak about a little bit about, I mean, I know it's an immensely complicated theme, but the difference in that respect between Islamic and Byzantine attitudes on the one hand, and Roman and Christian perhaps attitudes on the other hand. Over to you.
Well, I can speak about that, but not a little bit. I mean, that's too, let's say, a shoreless ocean. First, let me perhaps begin with making a distinction. I'd like to drive a wedge between two points of view. There's the objective fact on the one hand, and the objective, historically accessible fact is that each and every civilization, culture, or you name it, borrows from other earlier cultures or civilization. Okay, this is a fact. On the one hand, there is the consciousness of what happened, and the consciousness can be either, honest or not that honest. An honest consciousness acknowledges that it has borrowed from earlier states of civilization. In my book, I quote, if my memory serves me, a short passage from the so-called pure brethren of Basra, the authors of this slightly Ismaili tinged encyclopedia written in quite a simple Arabic, by the way, probably in the 10th century, but the things are not that sure. Well, be that as it may, the authors utter the following opinion, i.e., each culture borrowed from even the Greeks, which which apparently were a source, are the result. And by the way, the Greeks themselves were pretty conscious of that. There's this passage in Herodotus, in which he explains that the Greek gods were some sort of Hellenized version, adaptation of the Egyptian deities. Okay. But what is extraordinary about European culture is that it referred to sources which are outside of it. That's what I call eccentricity. I take the word not in the meaning it had in this Oxbridge joke about weird people who resemble those eccentric cycles in pre-Copernican astronomy. No, I take eccentric literally. I mean with eccentric something the center of which is outside of it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And well, it is a fact that the reference points of European culture lie outside of the European realm, i.e., for Jerusalem, this is obvious. But Athens is outside of the European realm. The Greeks never considered themselves as Europeans before the 19th century. And it might even be the case that they still do not consider themselves as being full-fledged Europeans, but something between Europe and Asia. Well, be that as it may, let me first mention a fact about Chinese culture. Neither Byzantium nor Islam, but China, the remotest culture geographically and culturally from the point of view of Europe. Well, the higher civil servants were recruited on the basis of competitive examinations, the topics of which were Chinese classical works. The Chinese classics, the grounding books of Chinese culture. In Europe, the elites were recruited on the basis, were recruited by competitive examination, the same way as in China, but the topics were the works of another culture. Just, well, since you are culturally English, you remember the way in which the examinations in Oxbridge took place on the basis of the knowledge of Greek classics. You remember the way in which Thomas de Quincey, for instance, challenged this bishop. He tells this in his Confessions of an Opium Eater. He challenges a bishop by writing him a letter in ancient Greek. And well, there are plenty of examples like that. People were educated to read, write, and write poetry. I'm thinking of Gerald Manley Hopkins, for instance. Of Oscar Wilde wrote Greek poems. And well, this is extraordinary. A normal culture. And Europe is an abnormal culture. Europe is the contrary of a run-of-the-mill civilization. A normal civilization refers back to its own sources. Europe referred back to the sources of a civilization which he felt as different, a civilization towards which it felt estranged. That's fantastic. Yet to come back to Islam and to Byzantium, which was the real core of your question. Well, Byzantium had not to get back to Greek. It was Greek. People were, Greeks by blood, let's say. They spoke Greek. Of course, the language had changed, but okay. They lived partly on Greek soil. Well, getting back to the Greek meant that they had to get back to their own sources. They had to burrow deeply into their own past. They had not to look for something different, for something external to them. And as far as Islam was concerned, well, there's a word which captures the situation pretty adequately. That's the word which designates what came before the revelation granted to Muhammad, to the Prophet. It was jahiliyyah, ignorance. Ignorance. What came before Islam was ignorance. Ignorance. And for this reason, every knowledge was supposed to have been vouchsafed to the Prophet. Hence, the legend according to which the sciences are all in nuce, potentially, in the Quran. Hence, the answer of this Egyptian scholar to Napoleon. Well, he wasn't yet Napoleon, he was Bonaparte. Well, when he went to Egypt, this scholar, Muslim scholar, told him, well, each and every science is in the Quran. And Bonaparte asked, well, the art of making guns, is this in the Quran? Answer, yes, of course. If you read the Quran carefully, you'll find it. And well, still no, at present, as soon as a new, let's say, scientific discovery reaches, say, Egypt, about, molecular biology or whatnot, there is a book which is published which explains that molecular biology is in the Quran. And if you read some verses, perhaps not with great philological accuracy, but if you read that, you can find some equivalent when the world is said to crumble into pieces, into specks of dust. Well, that's the atoms. That's the atomic theory. And for this reason, people, the Western scientists who claim to have discovered the atomic structure of matter, was simply cribbed more or less consciously everything from the Quran. This might be, that's the mood question. This might be one of the reasons why the Islamic peoples were so reluctant to accept, scientific achievements, although they were perfectly able to, make great progress in mathematics in the Middle Ages or in other fields of science. But there was some reluctance against whatever was new. There are some utterances ascribed to the Prophet Muhammad, according to which what is best in a thing lies at the beginning, and what comes after, is not as good.
I find that so interesting. The tension in what you're saying between the idea of oneself as a source and the idea of oneself as a transmissive aqueduct is just such an interesting contrast in what you're saying. But I wonder, given time presses, unfortunately, I just if I could put to you a different kind of question, really, Rémi, about your work. So much of what you've written, including some of what you've said to us today, has been concerned with the idea of being, so to speak, moderately modern, getting the best of the modern project, while at the same time avoiding the tendency to succumb to a kind of crude or destructive view of the past. But so what I want to ask you is that, given what you've been saying about the creative role of transmissiveness of tradition, the idea of a perpetual return to prior sources, a reinterpretation of prior sources, your idea of many renaissances, not just one, this has been so crucial in the development of the West. What do you think about what you might say is the modern tendency to set us free from dependence on tradition, or set us free from all external sources of authority. Has this affected the West to the point where one could speak of, the decline of the West? Once this constant European reenacting of the past, return to this transmissive notion of the past, once that ceases, once the sense of secondarity that you talk about fails, then Europeanness itself will kind of cease to exist as a self-consciousness. Do you see that as a risk, as a direction that we are heading in educationally, culturally?
Well, that's a tall order. Well,
Sorry.
first of all, you mentioned. Oh, no, you're very welcome. You mentioned the title of this book, Moderately Modern. Well, were it not for the outstanding humility which has swept me to the pinnacle of fame, I would be flattered. I would be flattered, for I like the title, that's one of my best titles. Well, let me once again make a distinction between modern times, and the modern project. What I call the modern project, what I call with other people, the modern project. Modern times, well, that's a historical period, beginning with the fall of Constantinople, or with the Lutheran Reformation, or with the discovery of America. Okay, anyway. And this historical period brought about, well, every kind of new things, good things and bad things, in the same way as the Middle Ages, in the same way as the ancient world, in the same way as our own world. We are all in the same predicament as far as, well, goodness and badness of achievements is concerned. This on the one hand. On the other hand, the modern project consists of an attempt at weighing the anchors vis-a-vis whatever is received. And, well, this project of a radical autonomy, of some sort of self-createdness of the human beings, is all the more paradoxical that we are more and more clearly aware of our dependency. Well, we know at present, thanks to physicists, that the atoms which constitute our bodies were, well, created or produced or arose, some short spell after the so-called Big Bang set in. We know, thanks to zoologists, that we are the heirs of a long series of ancestors, beginning in the proverbial warm little pond which Darwin dreamt of. We know that that the language that we speak was not our own creation. The language which we speak, well, let's say the language which you speak, and the language which I borrow from time to time and give back to its legitimate owners as soon as possible, i.e. English, well, is the heir of a long series of mixtures, of cross-fertilizations between Germanic and French and Romance languages, and so on and so forth. Well, we know that more and more clearly that we are heirs to a very long past. And on the other hand, we do as if we were our own fathers. we do as we had nothing to learn from what came before us. And well, this might have dire consequences, for what we are. Well, is not that much. We are not big screaming deals. We are dwarves, sort of. Dwarves, well, sitting on the shoulders of giants, as the Bernard of Chartres said in the 12th century, to be sure. But if we climb down from the shoulders of those giants, well, we will be rather small. And first, and perhaps more deeply, that's an idea which I vented in other books that in the ones which you have just been kindly mentioning. The question is whether we have reasons, I mean good reasons, to go on with the human adventure, to further human history. And I very much doubt the possibility of our giving good reasons. Well, by the way, good reason is almost a pleonasm. A bad reason is not a reason, that's a cause.
Not a reason.
If we have good reasons for us to keep on launching new generations into the human adventure. I mean, our relationship to the past, our consciousness of being heirs to ancestors, is what enables us to become ourselves ancestors to younger generations.
Yeah,
the
brilliant.
idea is in Edmund Burke, by the way. The idea is in Edmund Burke. This wonderful sentence in his Considerations of the French Revolution. I couldn't give you chapter and verse, but that's in the book. You know, people who don't care for their ancestors won't care for their offspring. There's a sentence in that. Well, the meaning is there. The exact wording is something different. But
right.
Anyway, the idea was taken up by Tocqueville, by our great physical thinker of the 19th century, Tocqueville. You know, I may quote that in some place. Yeah? Well, that's my idea. You know, history is a continuity, and if there is no higher source in the aqueduct, which we are, where there won't be water in the sinks of our offspring.
No, that's beautifully put. Thank you for that wonderful answer. And look, because we're almost out of time, Professor Brague, I'd like to ask you a slightly different kind of question at the end. And in a way, it's connecting this fascinating talk that you've given us to our last speaker, Professor Robert Toombs, whose work you may be somewhat familiar with, the historian. And it's to do with what we've called in the in Le Monde Anglo-Saxon, you know, the English-speaking world, we call them the culture wars. The culture wars, and this was something that emerged in conversation with him. Many of us have the impression that the Anglo-Saxon world is different from continental Europe, let's say France or Germany or Italy, and as well as from the rest of the world when it comes to this phenomenon of culture wars. Toombs suggested in his recent talk for us that both on the left wing and on the right wing, doesn't matter what their political affiliations might be, that for French intellectuals, France belongs to them. They still see France as theirs. Whereas in some sense, the Anglophone intellectuals in universities and elsewhere are increasingly hostile to their own culture, their own civilization, their own establishment, if you like. So in any case, there seems to be a difference between the attitude towards one's own culture in French and German and European intellectual life on the one hand, and Anglophone intellectual life on the other hand. One theory about this that fascinates me is that the reason for this, or part of the historical source of this, is what you might call nonconformist Protestantism, very powerful in the development of Britain and the United States, more so than it was in Europe. Very significant, for example, in the abolition of the slave trade for the first time in human history on both sides of the Atlantic. And so I wonder whether this phenomenon that we're experiencing nowadays, called the cancel culture, which seems to be an Anglophone phenomenon rather than a French one, whether this is a form of hyper-Protestantism, thinly disguised, extreme nonconformist criticism towards the establishment, which also maybe contains elements of paganism, which reacts with the divisions and the doubts brought by Protestantism and has a new entity which has disenchantment in it as well as spiritual ambiguity. Anyway, I would be very interested to hear you, as a distinguished French scholar, give us your thoughts on this difference between the cancel culture movements in the Anglophone world and the Francophone world, where it hardly seems to exist in the same way. The intellectual establishment in France doesn't seem to turn back on its own culture in the same way that we've seen happening in England or in the US. So briefly, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, briefly, I'm afraid I can't be brief. Well, first you mentioned the difference between the right and the wrong side of the channel. Well, I'm happy to say that I live on the right side, but I'm afraid the right side may still be becoming the wrong one. The wrong one. I'm not that sanguine about any possible difference of stance between French intellectuals and, let's say, intellectuals who belong to the so-called Anglo-Saxon side of the culture. To be sure, the cancel culture began in the US, and then invaded the UK. But it is invading at present the Hexagon, France and other countries. As far as Germany is concerned, well, although I spent some time in Germany some time ago, I'm afraid I had to retire more than 10 years ago. Perhaps I'm not that conscious of what's going on in Germany at present. But as far as France is concerned, well, the French intellectual world is deeply split asunder by those wars. There are people who, would like us to indulge in some self-accusation, some guilt against our own past, and the other ones who, and I must confess that I belong to those people, to this side of the divide, who say that, to be sure, we have to acknowledge that our past was not a long series of light and I mean, the light we spread light and sweetness. But
Matthew Arnold.
But that, yes, we can defend. Just for instance, you mentioned slavery. Well, slavery was abolished. Not only slave trade had to come first, but slavery in itself was abolished in Europe and not in other countries. The other parts of the world had to follow suit, and partly because of the pressure exerted by European countries. Okay. And we can be tolerably, moderately proud of our achievements. And we don't have to reject what made us. And this is all the truer that we should perhaps ask other cultures to look more closely at what they did. We are tearing down statues of people. Cecil Rhodes, for instance, was first demoted. But I've heard recently that there is, in some Central Asian countries, Uzbekistan, if my memory serves me, but I'm not that sure. Always confused about those former Soviet republics of Central Asia. Well, be that as it may, there are in those countries huge statues of, how do you call him? Tamerlane? Tamberlane?
Tamberlane, yes. Yeah.
Tamberlane, and these people killed, according to historians, between 1 and 17 millions of people. Between 1 and 17. Well, let's say 10 millions. Well, that's better than Hitler. That's better than Stalin. And nobody speaks of destroying those statues which are 6 or 7 meters high and which represent the conqueror as a warrior, introducer of civilization, his civilization, the way in which he conceived of civilization. Well, perhaps we should gently ask other people to apply the broom as efficiently as we do in our own culture. Why should we the only ones to repent? And this might have something to do with what you called hyper-Protestantism, an enhanced consciousness of one's indignity. Well, that's a good thing, provided forgiveness remains possible.
Well, I think that's a lovely note to end our discussion on today, Professor Brague, provided that forgiveness remains possible. Can I just say it's been a complete privilege and a treat to listen to everything that you've had to say to us today. I'm so grateful to you for speaking to us and for agreeing to speak to us in the language of the people on the wrong side of the La Manche. That's very gracious of you to do that. Contemporary.
Those people begin with living on the wrong side of the channel. Little wonder that should end up driving on the wrong side of the road.
That's right. So look, I think contemporary politics is too much on our minds much of the time today, tragically so right now in the Middle East, and then in the last year or so in Eastern Europe. It's really a delight to refresh ourselves at the sources of the deep culture that runs through our hearts and our spirits, and whether we always recognize it or not, and certainly in the company of such a learned and incisive guide. So thank you so much, Professor Rémi Brague, for joining us today. Very grateful to you. Thank you.
Well, you're very welcome. I thank you, and I wish I'll be able to see you in the flesh some of these days. Well,
indeed, I'd look forward to that very much, very much. And so thank you again. And can I just say then to our audience, please keep an eye on our website for details of forthcoming talks, both online and live, which we hope you will find as fascinating as today's talk from Professor Rémi Brague has been. And this is Simon Haines at the Ramsay Centre saying goodbye for now.